Hi, everyone. You're in Catwoman. So the next session, or the first session, actually, is by Chris Stewart, Big Nerd Ranch. Take it away, Chris.
Okay. Hello. Can you hear me? Good? Okay. Welcome. I'm excited to be giving the first mobile talk. Very excited to be here. I'm going to be talking about coordinator layout. I know this talk sounds a little design-focused, and there's going to be not much design, actually. It's going to be much more aimed towards developers. And also, I'm going to assume, so I put this at intermediate level. I'm going to assume that you guys are Android developers. I hope that's the case. But that's the, seeing some no's. That's the assumption that I've made. But there'll be some fancy demos and things if you're not, and we'll give it a shot. So first, I should mention that my name is Chris Stewart, and I have to mention, why I'm here. I work for a company called Big Nerd Ranch. You may have heard of us before, maybe not. If you have heard of us, it's probably because of the books that we write. So our Android programming book, we just released second edition, which we're very excited about. I'm actually one of the authors of the book, so very excited about that. I should also mention that we also do a 5-day Android training class, which we teach very often. And we also do consulting work. Companies hire us to make their Android or iOS apps. So that's Big Nerd Ranch. That's where I work. Let's go ahead and get into the talk. So if you're like me, when you saw material design released at Google I/O about a year and a half ago, from a user perspective, I thought it looked really neat, right? It was a little bit different than what I was used to, but it looked exciting. It looked, visually stimulating from a user perspective, and I was excited about it. And you can see that the adoption of material design has picked up a lot just in the last year and a half, which is great. I think it's great for the platform. That said, when I saw material design released or announced as an Android developer, I kind of started to freak out, right? It looks really scary if you have to actually implement this stuff. There's a lot going on, and just to demonstrate it, there's this, crazy video, but if you start to look at these kind of animations that are happening, it looks really, really scary as an Android developer. There's all these transitions, these smooth things happening. How the heck am I going to implement all this stuff? My users are going to expect this. Designers are going to expect this. How do I make this a reality? So Google has tried to help us implement this kind of thing in some ways. It's still a lot of work, but they help you a little bit. So Google has released, for example, the AppCompat library, which you guys should be using if you're an Android developer. And more recently, Google released something called the Design Support Library. Have you guys heard of the Design Support Library? Okay. Some people say yes, some people say no. Just shout out some components. What components are in the library? Anybody know what exists? Coordinator layout. Yeah, great guess. Yes, that's true. What else? Floating action button. Yeah, there's a floating action button implementation, so you don't have to make your own anymore. That's really handy. Yeah, there are a bunch of, so there's the drawer view that goes in the navigation drawer. There's an implementation of tabs, a material design sort of tab implementation. It's like a collection of a bunch of little goodies for you as an Android developer to use. It's very handy. One of the things that's in this design support library that actually I don't hear a lot about is coordinator layout. And it's kind of an unknown. It seems sort of scary when you first see it because there's not a lot of documentation. You don't really know what its purpose is. But it's a really powerful tool, and I thought I would kind of explore how it works and then give this talk because I wanted to know a lot more about it too. And it's really just this sort of unknown right now in the community, and that's too bad because it's a very powerful tool. So that's what we're going to be talking about. So I kind of made a demo app, and I'll talk about how some of the common use cases of coordinator layout, and then I'll talk about how it works behind the scenes and how to customize coordinator layout to do something unique in your own application. I should mention, too, that coordinator layout doesn't it doesn't really work on its own. It doesn't, like, if you can't just use it by itself. It only works when you include other components inside of it. And so I'm going to kind of focus this on some of the components that you might use with Coordinator Layout and how that helps make things possible. Okay, so let me show you a demo here. I made a couple of examples, and I'm going to show you this example here first. So I have this sample application which has a list of the most popular free apps in the Google Play Store as of a couple weeks ago. And you can see there's a toolbar at the top of the screen, there's a recycler view, and then there's a floating action button down here in the bottom right. And I also have a coordinator layout in here. And so one thing coordinator layout allows me to do is that when I scroll, you can see the toolbar goes off the screen. This doesn't happen sort of automatically before coordinator layout. You would have to go through a lot of work to make that toolbar sort of scroll off the screen as you scroll the recycler view. And also, no matter how far I scroll down, I can now easily, as soon as I scroll back up, the toolbar immediately comes back into view. So coordinator layout makes this really easy to implement. You don't really have to do a lot of work to make this behavior a reality. So what coordinator layout does is it coordinates the movement of one thing with another thing. So when the user is scrolling in the recycler view, I want to coordinate that scrolling movement with my toolbar up here at the top of the screen. Coordinator layout coordinates movement of any components that you might want to use. In this example, I'm using a recycler view and a toolbar. So how do I implement this? Well, it's all in your layout file. So here's what my layout file for that view looks like. I have up at the top, I've got a coordinator layout here that I'm including as my root view. Coordinator layout in Android is, the documentation calls it a supercharged frame layout. So it acts like a frame layout if you use frame layout. And inside of there, I got a couple of components. I have this new component here you can see called the AppBarLayout, and then I have a toolbar. So I'm manually including a toolbar here, and I have this new AppBarLayout component. Toolbar itself, toolbar existed prior to this design support library. Remember, it's been around for a little while longer than a design support library. And so toolbar, it doesn't really know how to work with the coordinator layout. And so they've introduced this new thing called the AppBarLayout, which knows how to talk to the coordinator layout, knows how to deal with this coordination. And you just kind of have to wrap your toolbar in an AppBarLayout to enable this scrolling pattern that I showed you before. I also want to point out that there are some scroll flags on my toolbar that specifies how it should hide when I scroll. So you can customize this to do unique things if you want to. So for one of the scroll flags, I have the scroll flag. The scroll indicates that this should react to scrolling events. When I scroll, the toolbar should move. So that's what the scroll flag means. I also have the enter always scroll flag, and that enables that quick return pattern, that pattern where no matter how far down the recycler view I go, as soon as I start scrolling back up, the toolbar immediately shows up. So if I left that off, I would have to go all the way back up to the top to see the toolbar. So there are a bunch of scroll flags that you can use. There are these other two as well that I'm not showing, this enter always collapsed and exit until collapsed. These scroll flags are useful if you have a toolbar that it has a large size and then you want it to shrink down as the user scrolls. You see this a lot in Android or in material design spec. And you can use these two flags to allow that toolbar to shrink to a minimum size and scroll off the screen. And then also when you bring it back in, when you scroll back up, it can come back in at the small size. So those two flags allow that behavior. So this is how you use AppBarLayout to enable that scrolling pattern that I just showed. You can even go a little further with it. If you want to include tabs, for example, in your AppBarLayout, you can do that. You don't have to just have a toolbar. Here you can see I added a tab layout. And so in this case, I would have a toolbar with tabs below it. And you can do some really interesting things with the scrolling there, too. As you see, I have different scroll flags on the two widgets. By leaving off scroll flags on the tab layout, I'm saying I don't want this to be affected by the scrolling that the user does. So I have the scroll flags on the toolbar. The toolbar will go off the screen. On the tabs, I have no scroll flags, which means the tabs will be anchored at the top of the screen even as the toolbar moves on. So that's how you would anchor tabs to the top of the screen. Another handy pattern that you'll see a lot in material design. The default scroll flags is nothing. So yeah, this is just for demonstration purposes. You probably wouldn't define any scroll flags on your tab layout. Yeah. Okay, so this is one of the common things you would use with coordinator layout. I want to show you another example of something else that you would use.
But you must change your theme to use it, right?
You must change your theme to use coordinator layout.
Yeah.
If you're using the AppCompat library, you will have to use one of the AppCompat themes, if that's what you mean. But other than that, coordinator layout doesn't have, I don't think, any requirements on the theme. So let me show you another pattern here. I have this collapsing toolbar pattern, and you've probably seen this sort of thing before. So here we have a larger toolbar, and you can see the font size is pretty large in this toolbar. And then as I start to scroll, the toolbar collapses down, the font size changes. It's a pretty nice pattern, and then it's there at the top. And if I scroll back up, the font size increases. So you've seen this in material design spec, and it's actually, you could implement this yourself. You could use those scroll flags that I just showed you to make this a reality yourself. But if you did that, you would actually have to do a lot of work to affect the title. Notice that the title changes font size. You would have to kind of handle that yourself if you were manually having this toolbar shrink in size. And so there is another sort of tool that you can use to allow this transition, to allow the font size to change as you scroll. So you can see I have basically the same layout here, but now I have this new collapsing toolbar layout added into my view. And so the collapsing toolbar layout allows you to do that exactly what I just showed, where it changes the font size as you scroll. So it's another nice thing, and you can set the height on this to specify its large height, and it will scroll down to a normal toolbar height as you scroll. And you can set scroll flags on it as well.
Where's the recycler view in this? Is that
Yeah, sorry, so I left the recycler view out. I was running out of room, but it would be in the coordinator layout underneath the AppBar layout, so like in this area. So the recycler view is in there as well, and so is the floating action button. They're outside of the AppBar layout. So I also want to point out a couple other things about this. There's a collapse mode on the toolbar, and this specifies how it collapses. There's only two options here. There's the pin, which is just what you just saw, where that's the default. It just scrolls to a small size. But you can actually get kind of crazy with this collapsing toolbar layout, and you can add something like an image view inside of it as well. You've probably seen this before, where there's like a big picture that is the background for this large toolbar, and as you scroll, that picture kind of transition has a little parallax effect where the picture sort of gets translated a little bit as you're scrolling, as this toolbar is getting smaller and smaller. And then eventually, when you get to the minimum size, the toolbar is just a solid color. And so you can add an image view in here, give it an image, and you can give it this collapse mode of parallax, and that will allow you to do that. And you see this all the time in material design. Yes?
So image view isn't, it's a standard component. So does that mean it's using like standard callbacks to include in that, like set translation or whatever? So could you use this on like any other view, custom view?
That's a great question. Yeah, so the question, if you didn't hear, is, so image view is a standard component, and how is it doing that sort of parallax thing? Like, what if I wanted to make a custom view that kind of interacts with this and somehow? I don't know the answer, but I know that it is a regular image view, and so I would assume that there's some way to do that, but I'm not sure exactly what it's doing there. I did try, when I was testing this out, I put some other components in there, and it starts to look like ridiculously crazy. So it may be very tied to image view. I don't know. OK, so there are a couple of built-in things like this, like the collapsing toolbar layout, the AppBar layout, that make it easy for you to implement those sort of patterns. You don't have to write any Java code to make this happen. It's all here in the layout file, which is really nice. So there are some nice built-in tools like that. Another thing that coordinator layout interacts with is the floating action button. And there are a couple of really interesting things that you can do with the floating action button in the coordinator layout. So let me show you a couple of examples there. In this other example, I have the floating action button here anchored to my, my collapsing toolbar, my app bar up here at the top, which is really nice. You see this in the spec, but you don't actually see it very often in practice yet. But if you scroll, you can see that my floating action button is anchored there to the toolbar, and eventually, once I get to some kind of minimum size, it automatically sort of hides. And then if I scroll back up, it'll pop back in once I hit a certain size. This is a really nice thing, and actually, there's no, you can do this with anything. You can anchor any view to any other view if you want to. So here in that layout, again, I have a coordinator layout. I've got my app bar layout, which has, you know, the collapsing toolbar and the toolbar inside of it. I've given it an ID called app bar. And then my floating action button here, you can see that I've added the layout anchor layout parameter. And then I've added the anchor gravity layout parameter to anchor it in the bottom right. And that's it. Now this floating action button is anchored to my toolbar. I don't have to do anything else. It's just going to be there. It's going to hide at the right time. There's not really any other effort that you have to make, which is really nice. I haven't tried anchoring other views, but this anchor and anchor gravity, these layout parameters are part of the coordinator layout. And so you could theoretically use them on any two components that you want to anchor together. Do you have a callback like when it hides? No. And so when it hides, that's actually handled by the floating action button. And that's where I'll start to get into some details about how that happens. But it's up to the floating action button to hide itself when it decides it's the right time. But you could certainly customize that behavior. Or if you had a custom view, you could make it do whatever you want to at any time. And I'll talk about how that works in just a minute. Okay, so now let's get into some more kind of interesting details, some more like active sort of moving things. And this is where a coordinator layout starts to get really interesting. So I have, back in this previous example, I have that floating action button down in the bottom right. And I've set it up so that when I tap on this floating action button, a snack bar is going to show up. So if you're not familiar with snack bar, it's like the toast replacement. It's just a little message that comes up from the bottom of the screen. It'll stay there for a couple seconds, and then it'll go back down. And one of the really nice things that you can see that happens with coordinator layout, floating action button, and the snack bar is that when I show the snack bar, the floating action button reacts to the snack bar showing up. So if I show the snack bar, the floating action button transitions up a little bit. And then when the snack bar goes away, the floating action button moves back down. So coordinator layout is allowing us to coordinate the movement of the snack bar with the floating action button. And these two things can react to each other. Implementing this pattern that you see here actually requires absolutely no work from you at all. You don't have to do anything. So here in my layout file, I have the coordinator layout. I've got my floating action button. I don't do anything else. Because this floating action button is within a coordinator layout, and because I'm showing the snack bar within this coordinator layout, I don't have to do anything else, and this automatically happens. So this is some really powerful behavior here. But how does this work? You know, let's go into some of the details about how this works and how you could change this to customize it in your own application. And that's where we talk about coordinator layout's behavior class. So coordinator layout itself, it doesn't know anything about any of these components. Coordinator layout doesn't know about our recycler view. It doesn't know about the floating action button. It doesn't know about the app bar layout. It doesn't know about any of these things. It's kind of a basic thing on its own. And what happens is each of these components is responsible for supplying its own behavior, how it reacts to other components. So the floating action button, for example, is responsible for saying that if a snack bar shows up, I want to move out of the way of the snack bar. The floating action button is what defines that behavior. It's what provides that implementation. And you can customize this behavior yourself if you want to have some kind of custom thing going on as a result of some other view moving around. So the behavior can be applied in a couple of ways. And here you can see an example with the recycler view. This was actually in all of those previous slides where I omitted the recycler view, where I didn't show the recycler view. This is what was actually there. So I didn't show you this before, but it was in all of those examples that I showed previously. And on the recycler view, you can see that there's a layout behavior that's specified. So this is the recycler view's behavior inside of that coordinator layout. That layout behavior there, you can see it's @string/AppBar scrolling view behavior. That constant is defined for you in the design support library. And remember that recycler view, it doesn't exist in the design support library. It exists in its own separate standalone library. And so by default, recycler view doesn't know how to interact with coordinator layout or any of these other components. And so you have to go through a little extra step to hook it up to talk to coordinator layout. And that's what you're seeing here. We're setting a behavior on the recycler view. So it says when you scroll the recycler view, or it defines how it interacts with other views. This constant here is in the framework, but if you look at what it is, it's actually just pointing to a class file. So it's pointing to some behavior class that defines how this recycler view interacts with other things. And that allows all of those fancy scrolling things with the toolbar at the top of the screen. And of course, you can define your own behaviors, and you could supply your own behavior for this recycler view or for any other view in your view hierarchy. So this is one way that you define a behavior. Another way is with an annotation. So this is what's on the floating action button source. There is this default behavior annotation. So if no behavior is specified in the layout file, you can have a default behavior that this view will take on. And this is why that floating action button moved out of the way automatically. I didn't notice if I go back a couple slides, I didn't specify any kind of behavior here. It's going to rely on the default behavior of the floating action button. And so if you create your own class, you can supply this annotation and define your own default behavior for your class if it needs to react to other views. And this is how it's set up in the floating action button, and in a couple other items in the framework. So let's talk about how to customize this behavior and what's possible with these behaviors. So I have another example where I decided to customize how the floating action button reacts to the snack bar. So instead of moving up out of the way of the snack bar, I've modified it so that the floating action button will actually instead shrink in size when the snack bar shows up and then expand when it goes away. So here's the demo. So you can see the floating action button shrinks down. When the snack bar goes away, it expands back in size, which is kind of nice. It's a way to add a little tweak, and maybe, it might make sense in your app because maybe you don't want the user to tap on this floating action button once the snack bar is visible. So this is a nice thing to just add in to prevent that from happening. And so this is where we talk about customizing the behavior class. So I created my own behavior for this floating action button. Instead of using the default, I made my own. I called it the shrink behavior. You can see that my class extends Coordinator Layout's behavior class. So this class it uses Java generics. So you can see that generic type in the top right, the floating action button type. You're expected as that type to pass in the type of view that this is going to be attached to. So this shrink behavior is going to work with floating action button, and so that's the type I pass in as my generic type. After that, there are two constructors that you need to add. It's actually important that you have both of these constructors. So the default sort of empty constructor up there at the top with no parameters, that's the constructor that will be used if you define your behavior in this way, as a default behavior. So once this floating action button is inflated by the layout inflator and set up, that behavior will be created, and the default empty constructor, the one at the top, is the one that will be used in that case. So this empty constructor allows you to define it as a default behavior. The second constructor there, the context and the attribute set constructor, that's the one that will be used if you define your behavior like this, as a layout parameter on your view. If you define your behavior here on some kind of view, then the second constructor will be used with the context and the attribute set. So it's a good idea to have both of these to allow you to support both of those cases. All right, let's get into how the details of how you would customize this. So there are actually a whole bunch of methods that you can override in a behavior class. There are a ton of them. I'm going to show you two of them, what I think are the most important ones, but just know that there are a lot of other ones as well. There is, as a first example, this layout depends on method. And so this is how you specify what this view will interact with. So my floating action button interacts with the snack bar. When the snack bar shows up, I want to do something in my floating action button. And so I can override this layout depends on method and set up those dependencies. As one of the parameters, I'll be passed in this view dependency. And so basically what coordinator layout does is it's going to ask us, it's going to say, okay, do you depend on the recycler view? Do you depend on the toolbar? Do you depend on the app bar layout? And it's just going to ask us if we depend on each of the views that are in the view hierarchy. And you return true if you do depend on them, if you want to change something based on that view. And you return false if not. And so here you can see I'm returning true if the dependency is a snack bar layout. It's the view for that snack bar. If that's the case, that's when I return true. That's when I want to make something happen in my view. I should mention, I see people taking pictures of the slides. The slides are they're posted. It'll be available, so don't worry too much about taking pictures. You'll have access to them, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. So layout depends on, that's where you specify dependencies. Here I just depend on snack bar layout, but you could depend on multiple things if you want to. And this is how coordinator layout knows to let us know when the snack bar layout is added or moves or changes size. It's going to let us know that that has happened. So the last thing I implemented here in this shrink behavior is this on-dependent view changed method. And this is called when that view that you depend on has changed. So when the snack bar layout is added to the view hierarchy, this is going to get called. As it moves up from the bottom, this is going to get repeatedly called. And then as it starts to hide, this is also going to be repeatedly called. And so coordinator layout is telling you, okay, this thing is happening, do whatever you need to do as a result, and it's up to you to implement whatever kind of behavior you want to. And this is where I implemented that scaling behavior. And don't worry too much about the code that's in here. I basically copied it, I ripped it out of the floating action button behavior source, the one that translates up and down, and just kind of modified it to scale based on the percentage of the way up that the snack bar layout is. So if the snack bar layout is 10% of the way up on the screen, then I want to scale my floating action button, the inverse of that, 90% down. So when the snack bar layout is 10% up, the floating action button is 90% down. And it just works its way up until the scale is all the way to 0. So you can see that coordinator layout is really powerful. It allows you to define your own behavior. I can apply this to floating action button, which I did not write floating action button, but I can apply this behavior to it. Or if I created my own custom view, I could apply this behavior to that as well. So I thought I would take this a step further. So I kind of dug around in the material design spec, the sort of designer-focused specification for material design, and I found a pattern that I hadn't seen implemented before, and I thought I would give it a shot with coordinator layout and see if I could do it. It's I'll call it a unique pattern. Maybe there's a reason I haven't seen it before, but it might have a place in some places. So you can see I have now this new toolbar at the bottom of the screen. It's got a bunch of actions. And I've set it up so that this toolbar will hide when I scroll, but it hides in a unique way. So as I scroll down, you can see that toolbar transitions to a floating action button. It's got a kind of nice animation, and it transitions to this floating action button. And if I scroll back up, you can see it transition back out into a full toolbar. And I used coordinator layout to make this happen. And actually, I kind of cheated in the way that I implemented this. So if you look at how this top toolbar at the top here hides based on the scrolling, it actually does a decent amount of work to kind of hijack the scrolling events of this recycler view and kind of move itself. It's actually kind of involved. And I didn't want to write all of that code myself, since it's already up here at the top in this top toolbar. And so what I did is I cheated, and I depend on this top toolbar. So when the top toolbar, as soon as it becomes not visible, that's when I trigger my transition. And then as soon as the top toolbar becomes completely visible, I trigger the other transition, and now the toolbar is back there at the bottom. So I cheated, and I just started depending on this other view. So it definitely relies on this being up here at the top, but it made the implementation so much easier. So the way that this is implemented, there actually is a little bit of code for the the transition, the one with the circular reveal and the movement and all that stuff. And I don't want to go, I'll just show you the pseudocode in case you're curious. I don't want to go into too many details about that. But when it's time to hide the toolbar, so I'm going from the toolbar state to the smaller floating action button state, that's when this method is called. And you can see that I'm doing a couple things. Like the first thing I'm doing is I'm taking the floating action button and I'm moving it into the center of the toolbar, and I'm making it invisible. So the first step is to take the floating action button, put it in the center, make it invisible, because I'm transitioning from the full screen toolbar to the floating action button. And then you trigger a circular reveal. In this case, it could be called a circular hide, is probably a better name for it. But on the bottom toolbar, I'm doing that circular animation from the full size of the toolbar down to the size of the floating action button. So I'm kind of hiding the toolbar in a circular way. And when that animation is done, I make the toolbar invisible, and I move the floating action button, I animate the floating action button back over to the right side. So there is a little bit of code you have to write to make that happen, and this is the only code actually in the whole talk that is dependent on Lollipop. So everything I've shown so far will work just fine on any version of Android that you care about, but this circular reveal API is a Lollipop-only API. So this part isn't too important. I want to talk about how this works with coordinator layout. And that's this transforming toolbar behavior that I created. So in this case, I'm attaching this to a toolbar. And so that's my generic type up there in the top right is a toolbar, because this is going to be added to a toolbar. I'm overriding the layout depends on method again, and this time I depend on AppBarLayout. So basically, I want to know when that view goes off the screen and comes back on the screen. And then finally, I override that same other method, the onDependent view change method, and I just check to see when is the AppBarLayout, when is the toolbar visible, when is it not visible. So if the top of the toolbar is greater than or equal to 0, it'll always just be 0. That means the top is at the top of the screen. The top of the toolbar is at the top of the screen. You can see it. That's that top case. That's what I'll do the transition from the toolbar to the floating action button to the bottom toolbar. And then the other case, this get bottom, I'm checking to see, is the bottom of the toolbar above the top of the screen? That means it's not visible, and that's when I trigger the other transition. So there are a lot of possibilities with these custom behaviors. And you can implement some really interesting patterns that I haven't seen any implementation of this pattern before, so it was nice to give it a shot. Okay, finally, I want to mention there's a lot more to know about coordinator layout. So if you're curious, and maybe you've seen this before, Chris Baines, who's on the Android team, he works on AppCompat library and design support library. He has a sample project called Cheese Square, which is basically a demo app of the design support library. So it's got pretty much everything from the design support library in that app. And it's open source. I recommend checking that out to see a real implementation of all these things. And he uses coordinator layout there as well. Also, there's a great talk by Dave Smith. I don't know if you know about him or not. He's very active in the community. And only a couple weeks ago, he gave a talk on coordinator layout. And it's really good. You should definitely watch it if you're curious. If you want to know more about coordinator layout, I've tried to make my talk more of like an intro complement to his talk. So he goes into way more detail about like the scrolling events that happen and how AppBarLayout actually hijacks scroll events and how it goes off the screen. So he goes into the details about the parts that I cheated on and just sort of skipped out on. Definitely recommend checking out that talk if you're curious. And then finally, all of my code and a link to these slides is available on GitHub at github.com/cstew. So if you want to check out the code for the demo app that I created or look at these slides later on, you can find it there. Okay, so that is all I've got. Thank you very much for coming to my talk. And I can take a couple questions if you guys have them. I'll try to answer them. Are there any questions?
Yes, Dylan, I'll bring the microphone to you.
For the circular reveal of the bottom toolbar you showed, do you need to wrap that in a app toolbar layout at the bottom also, or only at the top of the view?
So to do this circular reveal?
Yeah.
So my view hierarchy in this example is, so circular reveal itself does not have any dependency on coordinator layout. You can use circular reveal anywhere. So my toolbar at the bottom is in coordinator layouts to allow this behavior, but circular reveal is just a sort of generic API that you can use on Lollipop Plus for any component.
To answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Other questions? Yes. Down here.
Where I don't see. Okay, this is going to be a pass along. Okay, so everybody try to pass the mic along.
Yes.
About the collecting toolbar layout.
Okay.
Do you know if they use behavior to animate the title? And if we could hijack it to change the behavior?
So the question is, yeah, does the collapsing toolbar layout use the behavior to hijack the title? To be honest, I don't know. I'm sure it does. It has to. Like, I don't know for sure. I didn't look at the source for that, but almost positively, yes.
Okay.
And I'm sure that you could change it.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, if that's it, thank you very much for coming to the talk. Please come up and talk to me at the conference. I'm going to be here all day. And here's what's up next in this room. But thanks for coming. The slides are available at my GitHub link here. Yeah, so just go there.